It's good to see a lot of new faces. And I guess I want to just say that this talk is inspired by my theology and trauma class members. A lot of them are not here, so this is a beautiful time for me to just reflect on how important that journey has been with them. As part of the trauma and theology class, I give students the option to alternate. Actually, I don't give them the option. I require them to alternate between an analysis post response to the readings on one week, and then the following week to do a creative post. So I'm sharing this image from one of the students in the course, Tomoko Kida. A student is with us for a year from Japan, and I asked her permission to share this. This was her reflection after the first week of that course, and I just wanted to share a couple sentences about her response. We were reading about the challenge of witnessing to trauma, the difficulty of that witness, and the importance of that witness. So these, I'll just open with her words. I painted worn-out glasses on the hands. The right side is broken and fixed by a Band-Aid. The two hands holding the glasses and branch are tightly together, trying not to drop them. Except for a tiny part of the right side of the lens, the glasses transparently picture the reality of this world in this painting, the reality of the branch. And on the other hand, through the tiny lens, we can see a small sprout budding. The two hands, which are tightly together, trying not to drop glasses, and the branch indicate the resistance to forgetting. I was asked to speak briefly about spiritual leadership in divided times. I've spent over 2 decades learning about trauma and bringing insights from trauma to bear on Christian theology. While Christian theologians have always addressed suffering, the phenomenon of trauma brings its unique challenges. The intergenerational transmission, the historical legacies of harm, the impact of harm on the body, and the neurobiology. This attention to trauma is important, and I feel privileged to have accompanied students through courses, through dissertations, and individual reflection about how trauma impacts them and their communities. And I, as a theologian, have the privilege of writing what I understand to be a testimonial practice of bearing witness to truths that are often unspeakable. When I was originally asked to give this talk, it wasn't connected so much to the election. So I wanted to just say this chart represents my fourfold hermeneutic or interpretive method for how to view texts and practices. That's the 4 on the inside. On the outside, it's surrounded by a fourfold model of embodied spirituality developed by Dr. Laura Kaptari at the Danielson Institute, and which she adapted it for our team working with urban congregations in the Trauma Responsive Congregations program. You'll see on those outside 4 boxes the impact of trauma, how trauma shows up on the body, the somatics, how it shows up in terms of agency, how it shows up in our meaning and meaning making, and how it shows up in shifts in our relationship. Without being trauma experts, faith leaders can account for these 4 core components of trauma. To be attuned to trauma in your context and to connect that trauma to your texts and practices, it's helpful, I think, to remember these 4 hermeneutical key insights about trauma's impact. The past is not in the past. The body remembers. Wounds don't simply go away. And imagination, I would say right now, collective imagination is diminished. So that's my fourfold hermeneutic. If you're going to incorporate it into a sermon, I would ask you, when you look at a biblical text, when you look at a sacred text, thinking of those 4 might be helpful for you to account for trauma's impact. Okay, that was the talk I was going to give. But this last decade of political divisions of a global pandemic that made even more visible the racial and economic disparities in our collective life impress upon me the need to work from the other side of trauma. By this, I mean if we know what we know about trauma, we need to think about spiritual leadership as that of guiding communities of faith and otherwise in the work of repair and healing. I recall Toni Morrison giving the famous Ingersoll lectures at Harvard Divinity School in 2012. The lectures have subsequently been printed in a collection called The Goodness in the Literary Imagination. For those unfamiliar with Toni Morrison's work, Morrison gave fictional voice to the intergenerational trauma of chattel slavery in the United States. This great fiction writer exposed how the ghosts of unacknowledged histories haunt us, not just negatively, but positively to do ethical work in the present. The good haunting that requires us to reckon with these histories rather than continuing to bury them. Through novels like The Bluest Eye, Beloved, Song of Solomon, and Paradise, Morrison confronted readers with a history that many did not want to see or name. Morrison writes about trauma. But in these lectures, she speaks about goodness. Quote, "Over time, these last 40 years, I have become more and more invested in making sure acts of goodness produce language." Morrison says that it is easy to write stories of evil, but it's harder to write the stories of goodness. I have been confronted, she says, by how attractive evil is to others. I am stunned by the attention given to its whisper and shout. Evil has a blockbuster audience, and goodness lurks backstage. She urges those within the Divinity School lecture hall to give goodness a voice. Morrison says that this will not redeem the suffering of the past or guarantee a future in which goodness overcomes evil, but it can cultivate the knowledge and moral clarity needed to move forward. Write stories that draw out the goodness, she advises. From her pen, or let's say computer, Morrison writes about the clearing, about a collective space of Black joy and sanctuary in which goodness is about what is shared, not individually possessed. Giving goodness a voice. Yeah. For those of us who work in religious and spiritual spaces, perhaps this is our challenge in this moment. When negativity, evil, and cruelty are at our scrolling fingertips and on display, when they lure us into paralysis and immobility, our theological mission may be to give goodness a voice. Work from the other side of trauma. I did not come to this insight through some cognitive aha moment or through deliberate decision. I came to it by way of exhaustion. In the summer of 2021, I felt like I had nothing to teach and very little to write. As requests for speaking about trauma flooded into my inbox, I was experiencing a level of spiritual fatigue that I could not ignore. So I began reading a lot of Howard Thurman. I turned to his writings and his sermons. Thurman is a figure, of course, who looms large at Boston University, but he became a guide for me and for my work in chaplaincy and for my own constructive theological writing. He was speaking about trauma before the study of trauma. And interestingly, he even used the language of the nervous system, talking about the need to rewire neural pathways to cultivate sensations of goodness. I'm going to say that again. He even used the language of the nervous system, talking about the need to rewire neural pathways to cultivate sensations of goodness. Goodness is not something we feel, It's something we cultivate. And Thurman believed that in climates of ill will, the work of churches, especially in worship spaces, was to collectively cultivate goodwill, palpably generating spiritual energy that could maybe possibly cut through toxic climates. It was an experiment, and worship was, for Thurman, the experimental space. If people from various backgrounds, beliefs, races, and cultures can experience the warmth of fellowship, they will leave the experience taking something of that warmth with them. It was not a belief that they carried away from church, it was a sensation. If I had more time, I would talk about the sensation of total regard. This is what I think Thurman was cultivating, that you could experience or feel in church. Walking out of Marsh Chapel, right? This is local history. Walking out of Marsh Chapel, having experienced this sensation of fellowship, the worshiper might be able to deposit something of that warmth into everyday exchanges. And instead of looking for goodness out there, you are its herald, its embodied messenger. Thurman believed that religion is capable of putting us in touch with an experience of life, capital L. It can bring us as exhausted ones in touch with an inexhaustible resource that can sustain us whatever the climate. But religion often loses its way and becomes not about this at all. It becomes diminishing and life-limiting. Thurman believed that worship spaces and classrooms can rewire us. They can be spaces in which to give goodness a voice. We know that he sometimes put a big question out there in class when he taught, and then he sat silent for 30 minutes. Teachers and students, preachers and parishioners were not there to debate goodness or to parse what it was. They were there to center down into the truth of who we are, a truth he believed that was contained in the spirituals, in the sung theology of his people. If I were teaching a class, we would do some exegetical work here. But I just want you to note here this theology of engaging with life for him came really from the theology of the spirituals. And here I'll just read it and let it sit with you. There's something present in the spirit of humanity, sometimes even taking the form of great arrogance, sometimes quietly nourishing the springs of resistance to a great tyranny. There is something in the spirit of the human that knows that the dualism, however apparently binding, runs out, exhausts itself, and leaves a core of assurance that the ultimate destiny of the human is good. This becomes the raw material of all hope and is one of the taproots of religious faith for the human spirit. When it applies to the individuals and becomes the norm of human relationships, a new sense of the ethical significance of life becomes manifest. This is his reflection on a bomb. There is a bomb in Gilead. Interestingly, he gave those lectures on the spirituals as the Ingersoll Lecture at Harvard Divinity School. So there's a nice connection there between Toni Morrison and Thurman. So I've found thinking with Thurman helpful, right, in my spiritual exhaustion, because he works from the other side of trauma. He studies everyday exchanges with people, how animals react under threat, how fear can immobilize us, how it can render us as non-agents subject to the control of others. I think Thurman would have a lot to say today about our current climate. What may be accounted for in this national election process is that losses, unprocessed grief, and unattended trauma can surface as resentment and bitterness. Unintegrated trauma can lead to cultures of ill will. So in 1953, Thurman made a collective diagnosis. There is something wrong with the collective. I feel this to be true. I feel this wrongness in myself, an edge that wasn't there before, a little less trust, a slow but incremental diminishment of my own moral horizon. It's harder to give goodness a voice, especially when you begin to lose the sound of goodness within you. Morrison gives goodness a voice by exploring characters from every angle, materially, spiritually, morally, religiously. And for Morrison, this capacity to depict a character from different angles as a fiction writer is an intentional practice of cultivating an imagination for goodness. Imagine what motivates the person sitting next to you. What experiences went into making them who they are? Who are their ancestors? And how do these ancestors continue to live in them? What are their dreams? These are things that a fiction writer does when creating a character, imagining characters in all their texture and specificity. Goodness is not something we feel, it's something we cultivate. Perhaps we can think about what we're doing at the School of Theology as learning to write a goodness story. This is not an escapist story fueled by an otherworldly soteriology, but a this-worldly story guided by God's Spirit, who across histories inspires, sparks creativity when we're stuck in our rhetorical silos, that animates when we're standing in valleys of dry bones and we feel that our own bones are deader than dead. And that spirit, that ruach, that wind, that inhale shows up, as Thurman describes it, as warmth between people, as an animating collective breath that finds alternative routes through existing divisions. I leave you with one of my favorite insights from Howard Thurman and escalators. I will expand a little by giving you a sense of where he's at because it's a local story. At the end of a long day when Thurman was chaplain at Marsh Chapel, Boston University, at the end of a long and weary day, well, let's just say before the end of a long, weary day, he would leave the office, and he explains this to an interviewer. He says that he leaves Marsh Chapel at 3 o'clock, walks down Bay State Road, enters his apartment, and announces to his wife, Sue, that he's heading downtown. He changes clothes, and he said, I'd change my clothes so my nervous system would get the message also. Yeah, it was really about the nervous system. And then he walks down Commonwealth Avenue to the public garden, crosses it near Park Street Station, takes a right, and ends up at Downtown Crossing. Ends up what used to be Jordan Marsh Department Store, now Macy's. I think it's still Macy's. Where at the time in the 1950s, the newish electric staircase transports customers between floors. You can click. Thurman steps onto the escalator and rides up and down for a half an hour. He called it a mini vacation. Trauma folks would call it a practice of somatic grounding and regulation. The predictable pace of the escalator moves his body in steady rhythms. It is his practice of resetting himself. Thurman was working in a climate of disregard. As a Black spiritual leader working in a predominantly white institution, this job was hard on Thurman. But there's more to this escalator practice. Thurman says that he walks over to the jewelry department and drums up a conversation with the sales clerk. He asks the clerk about diamonds. He enters into the clerk's world. For 5 to 10 minutes, he enters a world that is nothing like his own. He becomes very curious about the cut of diamonds. What is it like to be you? Right, this is like Thurman. It's like, what is it like to be you, the diamond salesman? It seems incidental, but Thurman was deliberate about most of the things that he did. So this convivial exchange with the sales clerk was an important component of the escalator practice. Steadying the body and entering into the world of someone else. Cultivating curiosity between strangers feels so micro, but I think it's essential to cutting through climates of disregard. After a short period of time, Thurman reports that he was refreshed. Changing the climate of division seems too insurmountable, especially today. But I'm convinced that we're already practicing it here, that we're experimenting with what it means to cultivate fellowship in our thoughtful, probing questions and our attempts to understand each other. And on Monday, I'm back to my class, on Monday, just 2 days ago, I wrote this reflection on the train back on Amtrak. I think there's a couple people from the class. Some were sleeping, some were studying. I was panicking. So on Monday, a group of STH students, along with Charlene and others, traveled to New York City. We went to the 9/11 Memorial Museum. Obviously, in a trauma class, this is a trauma museum that marks a national tragedy. And we met with the curators from the museum. And some of our members of our group were deeply connected to this event. And many in the group were trying to understand the impact of a traumatic event that was not our own, not our country, not our generation. But the inquiry and the time together reflected the spirit, I think, of writing the story of goodness, of thinking from the other side of trauma. And a student pulled me aside, and I don't think he's here, so I can out him. And he said, Dr. Rambo, we're engaged in this very serious study of trauma, but you have a really good sense of humor. And I think Thurman would love it, right? That Thurman was after the sense of how do you cultivate. Now, we could debate whether I have a good sense of humor. But I think it was really important. I think he was saying, I feel a sense of warmth, right? Like there's something happening here that you're like more than the trauma teacher. You're more that there was something positive about it. I was like, don't explain too much. I don't know. But I think that was what Thurman was talking about is providing spaces or having opportunities in which we can cultivate that sense of warmth. And I felt it on Monday, right? This is the collective experience of, being in New York City. What does it smell like? What does it feel like? My search for bagels, which is intense. Eating New York pizza. And we did a very intense activity, right? We were talking with people about what they do and about their own work of bearing witness to trauma. But I think that Thurman would urge us as a School of Theology community also to take seriously that fact that we're experimenting and practicing to take a warmth across difference and deposit it, right, into the places in which we go. It's not incidental. So writing that story of goodness, maybe that's our new institutional mission. Thank you.